Hopefully you are in the right place. This is Introduction to VMware NSX for Automation. That would be NET1305BU. If you're in the right place, great. If you're not, stay anyway. We've got plenty of seats. So obviously we're going to be talking about automation today. I am Scott Goodman. I am a product marketing manager with the networking and security business unit at VMware. So that would be NSX, and now, as you heard in the keynote this morning, App Defense as well. And we're going to hear from a customer later in the session. We have with us Brad Skeel. He's a senior manager of enterprise cloud ops and engineering at Deluxe Corp. And so we'll be hearing from him later in this session. So let's jump right into it. This is the disclaimer. I don't know what it all means, but they make us put it in there. So pay whatever attention needs to be paid attention to this. All right, so when we're talking about automation, there's a few common organizational and business demands that are universal, effectively. That's improved security and faster time to market, increased security and compliance, better utilization of IT resources so that not only physical resources, but human resources can be used more effectively on more strategic, higher value projects. And here we have this quote from Andrew Lerner at Gartner. You're all familiar with Gartner, the Magic Quadrant and all that. And he says of automation that configuration change and management of networking gear remains a primarily labor-intensive manual process. These suboptimal network practices result in downtime, reduced security, degrade application performance, and waste human and capital resources. So it's obviously, we're talking about efficiency here when we're talking about all of this. And before we really dive into it, I just want to make it clear so we're all on the same page. This is an introductory section. It's going to stay pretty high level. We're not going to get real into the weeds on anything here. We'll hit on some technical concepts, but throughout I will point you to some more technical sessions that will help you understand some of the topics we're going to talk about a little bit better. So what's getting in the way of achieving this speed and agility and security and all of that? Well, the answer is, one, we have inconsistent tooling. Two, we have these manual processes that are slow. And three, we have this complex physical infrastructure holding us back. And so that begs the basic question, well, how do we address all these challenges to ensure that IT can move forward at the speed that business demands? And the simplest, most general answer to that is that we need to virtualize, we need to standardize, and we need to automate the infrastructure, applications, and services that we need. So before we get into automation itself, let's get a little bit of background here on network virtualization and NSX in general. And I will point you at the end of this section to the intro to NSX session because of some funky scheduling. This automation session ended up before the main NSX intro session. So you can check that out later today, and I'll get to that in a few minutes here. So there are three basic building blocks of the data center. There's compute, there's storage, and there's networking. We all know that. And this is what you build your applications on. At this point, over 70% of all servers have been virtualized, and that number continues to increase every day. Server virtualization at this point is a known quantity. I mean, that's what VMware is famous for, vSphere, ESX. That's a known thing. And to a large degree, storage virtualization is an increasingly known quantity as well. In VMware's case, that would be something like vSAN. You know, it's inherently tied to the compute. But there's been something missing from this vision, this software-defined vision for the data center, and that's the networking part. Largely remains hardware-centric and unvirtualized. So networking fundamentally hasn't changed that much in decades. We've seen a shift from your traditional three-tier architecture to a more leaf and spine architecture, but fundamentally, networking is still a hardware-centric, hardware-defined, rigid, and complex system in most cases. There's a dynamic market survey that notes that 90% of all people surveyed acknowledge that they're limited by the complexities of their physical networks and their physical environment when it comes to deploying and provisioning applications and services. So the overwhelming majority of people understand the problem here. And the average wait time for a new or updated service when you're talking about a not fully virtualized environment can be on the order of 270 days from start to finish. So network virtualization starts with the existing infrastructure when we're talking about NSX. Nothing needs to change. This is an overlay. So whatever you have underneath is okay. x86, it forwards IP packets, you're good to go. We have a lot of customers that are deployed on things like Cisco Catalyst 6500s, Nexus. We have a lot of customers that will build greenfields on Cisco 9Ks using a spine and leaf type architecture. But the physical network underneath can also be Arista, can be HP, can be Dell, doesn't matter. The point here is that NSX is kind of agnostic. It gives you the choice to use whatever vendor you have already or whatever vendor you want to be using because it's an overlay. And you're already doing some virtualization in that you're likely familiar with the vSwitch. And that's kind of the beginning of all of this. So NSX takes the concept of the vSwitch to a whole new level. It abstracts all of the networking functions and runs them in software embedded in the hypervisor itself. So this isn't just some virtual appliance. You know, you can have a virtual firewall or a virtual load balancer or whatever. It's not just a virtual appliance. It's actually embedded in the hypervisor itself. In terms of the cloud, we run these networking functions as a service. It's a SaaS-based model. And this delivers the functionality of hardware in software on whatever cloud platform you choose. When we look back at the hypervisor here, we have this, for example, this concept of the embedded distributed firewall that allows us to do true east-west firewalling on every workload, every virtual machine, without the pitfalls of hairpinning that you would see in a physical environment. So there's this misconception in terms of networking that embedding everything in the hypervisor and this model will have a huge impact on performance. But this model is only incremental to what vSwitch already is doing. So because of the distributed nature of this, networking and security capacity is actually added every single time a new host is added. So each host adds, for example, 20 gigabits per second of firewalling capacity. So when you scale the application environment, you're also scaling security capacity. And we dramatically reduce the hops that east-west traffic has to take because it doesn't have to hairpin back up through a perimeter firewall or something like that. It can go directly across. So from a network perspective, this actually will increase your performance over a traditional architecture. So network virtualization is conceptually similar to server virtualization, as we've touched on. Server virtualization, as you know, reproduces the x86 attributes in software and can be programmatically assembled. Network virtualization creates the functional equivalent of a network hypervisor that reproduces the complete set of layer 2 through 7 networking and security functions. So in other words, NSX has created this abstraction layer, there we go, that sits between the underlying physical network and the applications and networks running on top of it. So it's this overlay that sits between both in this sort of ideal spot in the architecture. So whether you're running VMs, containers, some combination of the two, something else altogether, you can spin up networks in just a matter of seconds. So we all know that what network virtualization and NSX can do for us in the data center, complete that last pillar of the vision of the software-defined data center, but it goes beyond that at this point. NSX is going to empower you to bridge your different current and future environments. And here we're talking about, obviously, your data center, but we're talking about your public cloud environments, your AWSs, as you heard this morning, and your Azures. And it's also going to allow you to have an overlay that connects your remote and branch offices, as well as ultimately endpoints that are Internet of Things enabled devices. So NSX is this connective fabric, this connective tissue, not only for the data center, but for all of your connected environments. Data center, public cloud, remote and branch offices, and Internet of Things enabled devices. So as I touched on earlier, because of the scheduling, this session is actually before the main Intro to NSX session. I would recommend that you go to that Intro to NSX session if you're looking to understand the broader concept of network virtualization and some of the other use cases that we touch on. And it's called Introduction to VMware NSX, and it takes place later today from 4 to 5 p.m. So let's get back to our fundamental problems that are holding us up from achieving these results as it pertains to automation. We have to do some things in order to allow business to operate quickly, securely, and efficiently. We have to have our virtualization tools be consistent. We have to have automated, standardized processes, and we have to virtualize our infrastructure and security controls. These are all going to be key to enabling us to do a number of things with automation as it relates to NSX and help us achieve business goals, which is the ultimate outcome. So we have 3 primary use cases when we talk about automation in NSX. This is not an exhaustive list, nor are any of the other use case lists for NSX. But these are the primary ones that we see when we go out and we talk to customers and we hear feedback and all of that. So we have IT automation, developer cloud, which is a self-service concept, and multi-tenancy. So first we're going to hit on IT automation. This is kind of the status quo current state of the lack of automation, rather. And I'm going to use the laser pointer here because I won't pass up a chance to play with a laser pointer. As it stands, current infrastructure provisioning is traditionally a slow, complex, manual process. Some of you may have automated some parts of this process to some degree using scripts or something like that. Maybe your compute provisioning is already automated. Maybe your storage is already automated. But what we see here is that the networking and security component of provisioning is consistently and overwhelmingly the most common bottleneck in this entire process. And it can add days or weeks to the entire thing. So it starts with a user requesting a new app. This is going to generate a ticket, and it's going to go through all these teams. Again, not an exhaustive list, just an example here. They're often different roles. They have different skill sets. They're working kind of in silos, and it's just not an efficient process. And then it gets to that bottleneck again, and it's going to take days or weeks more to provision networking and security on top of all of this. Then, cool, you've deployed it. It's all ready to go. But if at any point in day 2 or any point during this process a change needs to be made, you kind of have to start right over from the beginning and reinvent the wheel. So it's not an ideal model for provisioning and deploying infrastructure. This is kind of the NSX vision of how this should be done. And visually, you can see that it's greatly simplified because it is greatly simplified. It's going to allow introducing NSX into this process is going to allow us to accelerate workload deployment, avoid the risk of human errors, which create a lot of extra work for everybody. And it's going to increase the compliance and auditability of this whole process because things are being standardized. So IT organizations will use a cloud management platform here. We have vRealize here, obviously, because it's our product, but it doesn't have to be vRealize. It can be VMware Integrated OpenStack, VIO. It can be other OpenStack releases. We have customers using all sorts of different cloud management platforms to do this. We just obviously provide one in the form of vRealize automation. So they'll use this cloud management platform to create automated blueprints of infrastructure configurations, including networking and security components. This allows configurations to be centrally managed and allows for full stack applications to be delivered more quickly and securely without being bottlenecked by that process that we touched on earlier. And the key here is that while you may have already automated or are thinking of automating your compute and your storage provisioning, when you get that networking and security built in right from the beginning, everything's going to go faster, everything's going to be more connected, and everything's going to be more secure. If you want some more technical meat on this, there's a couple of sessions you can look at attending. There's infrastructure as a service and day 2 automation of NSX for vSphere using vRealize Orchestrator and vRealize Automation, and that takes place Thursday from 10:30 to 11:30. And this is all, you can look it up in the content catalog. And then there's also one called Simplifying NSX by Automating with vRealize Automation, and that is Tuesday from 4:15 to 5, and again Thursday from 11:45 to 12:30. So that'll dive more into how this is really done on, the nitty-gritty level. It'll take you into the UI, they'll do demos, things like that. Let's go here. All right, so next let's talk about the developer cloud use case for NSX and automation. And like I touched on earlier, when we say developer cloud here, what we're really talking about is a self-service model with catalog items, for example. So the current bad state of affairs, as it were, is that when a developer doesn't get the services they need quickly enough, a couple of different things can happen. You might have a quote-unquote rogue developer go around your IT organization and into the public cloud, into an AWS or into an Azure or whatever, and get what they need quickly, but it's not necessarily sanctioned by the business. And the problem with this is that, sure, they may get what they need quickly, but it's not as likely that it's going to be properly secured and properly connected to the environment that it's supposed to be working with. The second case is where you have a good citizen developer that goes through the whole process that we touched on earlier, that whole tangled web. The advantage there is that when it's all said and done, it's probably going to be fairly secure and connected to the environment that it's going to be operating in, but it's going to take forever. And it's going to be very costly, not only in terms of financials, but in terms of man hours used on all of this. So again, neither of these is exactly an ideal situation. So there's a couple of related outcomes here, depending on if we're talking about developers themselves or if we're talking about DevOps teams. And that's an organizational thing. It depends on what your organization looks like. For developers, the goal is to provide a consistent SaaS-based delivery approach using standard APIs. To do this, developers will make use of infrastructure templates using utilities like Heat and Terraform, and they'll use OpenStack APIs through NSX to create and deploy full-stack applications with the networking and security built in from the beginning. So it's not this bolted-on thing that happens later and takes days and weeks. It's in there right from the beginning. And this model enables agile development, it enables continuous deployment of applications, it makes use of infrastructure as code, and it provides a consistent security posture for these applications. On the other side of that coin, we have the DevOps related role, and the outcomes are going to be broadly similar with a couple of nuanced differences. So from a DevOps perspective, they're going to use configuration templates and configuration management tools, think your Puppets, your Chefs, your Ansibles of the world, in conjunction with the native NSX API, and this is going to do the same thing at the end. It's going to deliver a full stack application with that networking and security built in right from the beginning. This makes the replication of services and applications much easier, even when you factor in staff turnover. It's going to enable faster deployment, and it's going to allow teams to use the existing tool sets to which they're already accustomed, those configuration management tools that we hit on just a minute ago. This is another one where if you want some more technical meat, there are some sessions for you. One example of this is vRealize automation for the developer cloud, which is taking place on Thursday from 1:30 to 2:30. So if you want to know more about this from a deeper technical perspective, that would be one to check out. So now let's hit on the last of the three we're going to talk about today, and that's multi-tenant infrastructure, multi-tenancy. And this is a little bit of a misunderstood use case. Many people think of multi-tenancy as the sole domain of cloud service providers. And it remains true that changing the multi-tenancy model can benefit cloud service providers greatly. That doesn't change. But it can also enable a business's internal IT organization to operate in a more service provider-like way, using a more service provider-like model for their internal organization. So, for example, an internal IT organization can use this to treat the different parts of the business like they're different tenants on a common infrastructure. You know, you could treat engineering, product management, marketing, sales, finance, HR, all of that. You could treat them as separate tenants so that they have the services that they need, but only the services they need, and don't have access to the entire environment when it's just not necessary. And for cloud service providers, obviously you want to keep your separate paying tenants separate from each other. They don't need to be able to see what the others are doing or requesting. So traditional managed services for cloud service providers are inherently limited in their scalability. They're expensive to scale, they use resources inefficiently, and they're really complex and slow to upgrade and secure. This model requires an IT organization or a service provider to maintain dedicated tenant cloud environments running on dedicated hardware, each with a physical set of infrastructure and overlaying cloud running on it, corresponding to a separate cloud instance for each and every tenant. The after state, as NSX sees it, is pretty greatly simplified here. NSX enables IT organizations and service providers to greatly simplify the multi-tenancy model and the operations that go with it. You can now use a single set of infrastructure to maintain a single cloud instance on which multiple tenants reside. So to achieve this, an IT team would make use of templates and service catalogs to provision VMs and virtualized networking and security services and deploy them in an automated fashion to each tenant as needed. Even though the IT team is now dealing with a single pane of glass here, a single set of hardware, a single cloud instance, it still appears to each tenant as though they're running on their own cloud instance and on their own dedicated set of hardware. You know, this is the benefit of network segmentation put into action right here. This model is going to increase the cost effectiveness not only for the provider side, whether again that's an actual cloud service provider or whether that's your IT organization providing services to your broader business. It's going to reduce capital expenses and operational expenses associated with buying and maintaining excess hardware that isn't necessarily adding any value to your side of the equation or to the tenant side of the equation, whether they're internal tenants or paying tenants. It's also going to increase security for both the provider and the consumer by using standard and consistent security configurations and policies. And the zero-touch service model enables changes to be made on environments on either side much faster, delivering faster time to value for providers and a better overall, more service provider-like experience for customers. There is another technical session here that will cover, among other things, multi-tenancy, and that's NSX design, reference design for the software-defined data center with NSX and vSphere. And that is happening from Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. So if you want to get a little bit more hands-on and a little bit more in the weeds on multi-tenancy, I would recommend checking that one out and also looking in your service catalogs for others as well. So with that, I'm going to invite Brad up to the stage, and he's going to talk about a real-world customer experience with NSX and automation.
Awesome.
Brad.
Thank you, Scott.
Welcome.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Brad Skeel. I manage the enterprise cloud operations and engineering team at Deluxe Corp in Minneapolis. Who is Deluxe? Well, Deluxe, for better part of 100 years, 102 years, was the country's largest check provider, check printer in the country. I don't know about you, but I remember when I got my first checking account when I was 16, and I went and opened it up, and 2 days later, here came my red and black box of Deluxe checks, and I thought to myself, oh, I'm rich now. So Deluxe, was a huge innovator in the check. The little micro code that you see on the magnetic ink digits that you see on the bottom of a check was a Deluxe invention. Deluxe invented a lot of check security things, fraud prevention in checks. If anybody saw the movie Catch Me If You Can, from Steven Spielberg and I think Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks were in it. Well, the guy that Leonardo DiCaprio played, the check forger, a lot of the things that he did, he actually consulted with Deluxe, back in the 70s or whenever, he was working with the FBI to help create a lot of the anti-fraud technology that are in checks. And so Deluxe is a big innovator in checks. But then it got disrupted. About 20 years ago or so, e-commerce and electronic payments came along and, people stopped writing checks. I think I maybe write 2 a year, and I work for Deluxe. And as part of that, Deluxe had to pivot and transform. And so, one of the thing that Deluxe has been pivoting into is a marketing and other services business, for a marketing and other services company for small businesses and financial institutions. So, we have 4.5 million small business customers. So everything from needing a logo for your company to website hosting and email, and I call it cradle to grave services. With financial institutions, we do a lot of big data analytics, and we do treasury management services, and a lot of the new gotcha term, or not gotcha term, but the new in term for this is fintech, financial technologies. So Deluxe is getting into that in a huge way. And so, starting about 10 years ago, Deluxe had to start transforming. The business had to start transforming in a big way, or it wasn't going to exist anymore. And so, this story of Deluxe's business transformation is really completely, tied to, our IT transformation. And so I started at Deluxe 4.5 years ago. The first 6 months that I was there, I was an independent contractor hired to deploy Microsoft Azure. Deluxe had been given, or they purchased a Azure subscription with an Office 365 agreement. And so, I was one of the guys at the time who had Azure experience, and so Deluxe hired me to help migrate some applications that they had into Azure. And I had, when I first had a lot of meetings with the powers that be at the time, I said, choose those applications very carefully, because what money and time you think you're going to save parking these applications in a public cloud, you're going to end up spending refactoring those applications. Because, for the most part, at that time, and this was back in 2013, there was no concept of cloud native. There wasn't even a concept of cloud friendly at Deluxe. Everything was it was either a very legacy platform, or it was a virtualized but very, traditional client-server multi-tier application. So we're talking about anything that was resilient enough to run and be fairly well managed in public cloud. And of course, what happened is what happened. People didn't, we tried, I tried explaining to everybody, hey, you should pick the right applications to do this. Nobody really listened to me. What does a consultant know? And so, it took a long time to get these applications in, and it ended up, yes, costing a lot more money than they were going to save. But out of that came some good thinking, because people started to think about cloud, like, okay, what is this, what should we be doing? In the spring of 2014, we started to really think, okay, so we're not going to take the current workloads that we have and put them directly in a public cloud. That's just, that's probably not feasible. But we really do need to figure out what our roadmap is for transformation. We've got to start thinking of these applications in a certain way, and we've got to start getting them, ready to either modernize or at least make them more resilient to running in a virtualized environment. And so we started coming up with our Deluxe Enterprise Cloud, or the DEC, as we like to call it. A lot of good learning came out of that. We drove a lot of discussion about, well, if we were building this from a greenfield scenario, what should we do? What are the things that we want this cloud to be able to do? And not only that, but, looking, into the future, what are the things that we want it to be able to support? And part of that discussion then came, we started to have the discussion about networking. And this was in 2014, probably the fall of 2014, early 2015. We started talking about NSX. We started talking about virtualizing network to begin with. And at the time, and to a larger degree, Deluxe didn't, outsourced its data center operations. So all the network team at Deluxe didn't really support the data center operations. They were more campus switch. More of a campus switch team. So when I brought up the idea of virtualizing the data center network, I didn't get any pushback. They were like, oh, hey, that sounds like a great idea. I love that. We should do that. And so we're like, okay, but then there was the why. Why do we do this? Why should we do this? And I made the argument at the time, I'm like, well, like the hypervisor, if I can take that infrastructure and turn it into software, I can move it around wherever I want really easily. So, Deluxe is a highly regulated company. We work with financial institutions. We print checks. We get audited by the federal government all the time. We have to meet a lot of security and compliance requirements all the time. And so, being able to transport and move that configuration and that security posture around in software is huge. And so out of that came, this seems like a really, really good, this seems like a good, direction to take it. And so we did. We went all in. So a lot of our peer companies, were more testing it and kind of, seeing how it works and we went all in. We decided when we built the enterprise cloud that NSX was going to be the core. And not only just NSX, but Palo Alto as well. So, Palo Alto as a firewall company, on the physical side, we had been using them for a few years already, but we decided we wanted to integrate the Palo Alto virtual firewall into and connect it with NSX. As well as Gigamon. We use Gigamon as well. But really the cornerstone of our solution was NSX and Palo Alto. Scott alluded to this earlier in his presentation about security as DNA, and it's baked into the DNA. When we designed our enterprise cloud, that's what we wanted. We wanted to have security be just completely embedded in this. This was not an afterthought. It wasn't something we were going to bolt on. It's something that we created, from day one. And so we launched it, and discovered, that, through using it with, we'd done some testing with vCloud Air, we'd done some other things with it, but knew that eventually the time was going to come when the being able to use NSX and transport that network configuration anywhere was going to be an important thing. And in fact, it was interesting. I was talking to one of the guys who works on my team this morning, and we were listening to the keynote and talking about AWS. And he gave me this, as Pat Gelsinger was talking about the whole AWS on, or VMware on AWS, and the ease of portability of NSX, and his eyes lit up, and he said, "Wow." And I said, "That's why we chose that 2 years ago. I knew this is where we were going to be heading." And so being able to use NSX in that space quickly and out of the box is going to be huge. And so, obviously, we want to, as we think about automation, everybody wants to automate. We want to automate. We started off automation, for us it's, we based everything on vRealize automation and orchestrator. It was a big, we're a VMware shop. We felt like at this point, as we're trying to decide how we want to build out cloud, it became really a concept of, do I want to create a cloud management platform from scratch with something like an OpenStack, or do I want to create something, or at least use some software that gives me a leg up, so I can just start bolting things together with some API code and some other things like that. And it made sense. It still makes sense that we went with vRealize automation. Certainly now we're working through a lot of, with the plugins for orchestrator, for NSX, and a lot of those things. Our phase one started with the VM build. Provisioning tends to be the first thing everybody wants to do. It certainly was the first thing we wanted to do, so we did it. The one thing about all of this, of course, is that, and I always stress this with people, it's one thing to automate the build, it's another thing to automate all the processes that go on top of it, right? So in order to make a workload completely usable for the customer, I've got to not only build the machine, but I have to configure it, I have to go through and do, I have to create the firewall rules, I've got to create, I have to do a vulnerability scan, I've got to do access controls. So, a lot of these things are manual processes. This gets back to the things Scott was talking about before, about how do you overcome that. And so a lot of that for us was, figuring out how to layer in automation of NSX. So how do we start, creating tags? How do we start micro-segmenting in our automation? We use ServiceNow as our service catalog. Our customers can go and order services. I would say it's somewhat mature. We're getting, obviously as we continue to refine our automation processes, it gets better and better. With NSX, we basically can allow people to go out and order or describe their workload in plain English. That was a big thing for me. It doesn't help to try to talk to an app owner or an app developer about subnets and things like that and port rules, because they're not going to figure that out anyway. The easiest thing to do is to ask them a lot of questions about the workload, and based on that, figure out what our tagging strategy has to be and apply those tags to that workload. And that's basically what we did. And so when we automate NSX, it starts with the order, and how do we do that? our customers can answer questions. We can go out and apply those tags, and then through that know whether or not one workload can talk to another workload. We have obviously some segments or some zones in our network that are very highly secure and regulated, PCI, HIPAA, that kind of data. We leverage, we've been starting to leverage Power CLI for NSX to help drive some more of the scripting automation for NSX and whatnot. And then have automated a lot of the workloads. So we're also doing some migration work, and as we bring those workloads into the new enterprise cloud from other data centers. So as we do acquisitions and whatnot, we end up collapsing data centers. We can use a lot of our automation scripting to apply NSX tags to that too. So what's our future? Definitely, we want to start doing requesting load balancers with NSX. We use F5 for external, but internal we do all NSX load balancing. We want to be able to add or edit tags post-deployment. In conjunction with security, obviously, there has to be a check and balance. It would be one thing to have a tag get edited, it has to be approved, stuff like that. Creation of isolated test networks. We do, as our developers start evolving and doing more what I would consider cloud native development, especially as the business starts asking us to pivot a whole lot more and a whole lot quicker, being able to spin up test workloads very quickly is a huge deal. Creation of virtual switches, certainly we want to be able to do that. And one of the things I'm working on right now with one of my peers who owns the app hosting and middleware team is that developer cloud. So the thing that Scott talked about in terms of being able to deploy an entire developer stack end to end is a big thing for us. We've got a couple of key applications being run on Docker right now. And so that type of development is only increasing, and we want to be able to, drop in a developer stack at any point. So a lot of upside, a lot of things going on. We're driving, NSX is again, a key cornerstone to the Deluxe virtualization and cloud story. So with that, Mr. Scott.
All right, thank you, Brad. We're just a couple of last orders of business here before we get to a little bit of Q&A. Just to recap what we talked about a little bit today in terms of the primary automation use cases around NSX. We talked about IT automation. That's accelerated self-service deployment, increased compliance and auditability because everything is standardized. There's that single point of failure. If there's a problem with something, it wasn't some individual setup. It was something in the blueprint, so you know where to go and look immediately. And we're talking about IT staff being able to focus on more strategic projects because the day-to-day management is kind of done away with. We talked about developer cloud and API-driven development and deploying, treating infrastructure as code, and automating the end-to-end life cycle of DevOps. And then we talked about multi-tenancy and the cost efficiencies that come with that, the zero-touch service model from both the provider and the consumer side that can come from that, and how that doesn't just apply to traditional cloud service providers anymore. And then the security applied to the provider and the tenant because of NSX's native security capabilities like microsegmentation and all of that. Please be sure to fill out the survey that comes with every session you go to. We do appreciate your feedback. We tweaked some stuff for these equivalent sessions this year based on feedback we got last year. So it's very helpful when you do that. And you'll be eligible for a drawing to win a gift card to the VMware merchandise store down here. So with that, thank you for coming. I hope you learned a little something, or at least, the very least, got me to point you to some technical sessions later in the week. And now, if you have any general questions, feel free to come up to one of the mics and we can take those for a few minutes here, and we'll stick around a little bit afterwards as well to answer questions one-on-one.